I arrived at Mark's office 15 minutes early for our quarterly portfolio review. His secretary wasn't at her desk, probably at lunch, so I walked down the familiar hallway toward his corner office. The door was half open, and I heard voices inside. Mark's voice, and another I recognized immediately. My son, Brian. I paused in the hallway, not intentionally eavesdropping, just hesitating before interrupting what seemed like a private conversation. Then I heard Mark say something that made my blood run cold. "We've already moved $380,000. The beauty of it is your father will never notice. He trusts me completely. He hasn't questioned a single statement in 15 years. I stood frozen, my hand inches from the door, listening. Brian's voice responded, lower but clear. "What about the audit? What if he actually reads the detailed reports?" "He won't." "He's 72, Brian. He glances at the summary page, sees the total balance is reasonable, and files it away. That's what old people do. They trust their advisors because managing money is too complicated. As long as the balance doesn't drop dramatically all at once, he'll never catch on. And if he does? Then we say there were market fluctuations, rebalancing losses, fees that weren't clearly disclosed. We have paperwork showing he approved everything. His signature is on all the authorization forms. Forms he never actually signed, Brian said. Forms he'll never remember not signing. That's the advantage of working with elderly clients. Their memory is unreliable. If he questions anything, we just tell him he's confused, that he approved it months ago and forgot. Who's going to believe a confused old man over his trusted advisor and his devoted son? I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. $380,000. My son and my financial advisor discussing stealing from me like it was a business transaction, discussing my age and trust as weaknesses to exploit. I walked back down the hallway as quietly as I'd come, out through the lobby to my car in the parking garage. I sat behind the wheel, hands shaking, trying to process what I'd just heard. My name is Edward Carlisle. I'm 72 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I believed the two men I trusted most in my financial life were protecting me. I was wrong. I spent 45 years as an investment banker, starting as an analyst fresh out of business school and retiring as a senior vice president at one of the largest investment firms in the country. I managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions. I advised corporations on mergers and acquisitions. I understood complex financial instruments, market strategies, risk management. Then I retired 7 years ago with a portfolio of $4.5 million, accumulated through careful investing, bonuses, profit sharing, and smart decisions over nearly 5 decades. It wasn't extraordinary wealth, but it was more than enough. Enough to live comfortably, enough to help my son and grandchildren when needed, enough to ensure I'd never be a burden to anyone. My wife, Margaret, had died 9 years ago from complications of diabetes. We'd been married 43 years. Losing her was devastating, but I'd survived by staying active, staying involved, staying sharp. I managed my own investments for the first 2 years after retirement, but as I approached 70, I decided it was time to hand over the day-to-day management to a professional. That's when I hired Mark Peterson. Mark came highly recommended. He'd worked at a reputable wealth management firm for 20 years, had excellent credentials, impressive client testimonials. He was 45 years old then, energetic, knowledgeable, and he treated me with respect. Not the patronizing respect some younger advisors show elderly clients, but genuine professional respect. "Mr. Carlisle," he'd said at our first meeting, "your portfolio is well constructed. You clearly understand investing. My role isn't to reinvent your strategy. It's to execute it, monitor it, and keep you informed. You're the decision maker, I'm the implementer." That approach had appealed to me. I didn't want someone taking over completely. I wanted a partner who would handle the mechanics while I maintained oversight. Mark seemed perfect for that role. For 15 years, our relationship worked smoothly. We met quarterly to review performance. Mark sent monthly statements showing detailed breakdowns of holdings, transactions, gains, and losses. The portfolio performed well, growing from $4.5 million to just over $5 million through market appreciation and reinvestment of dividends. I reviewed those statements carefully. At least, I thought I did. I checked the summary page, verified the total balance was increasing appropriately, scanned the major holdings. Everything always looked fine. The numbers made sense. The growth was reasonable. I had no reason to question anything. But standing in that parking garage, replaying Mark's words in my mind, I realized I'd been reviewing statements the way he expected me to, the way he'd counted on me to. Superficially, trustingly, like an old man who didn't want to bother with details anymore. Except I wasn't that old man. I'd spent 45 years analyzing financial documents. I knew how to read statements, how to spot discrepancies, how to trace transactions. I'd just stopped doing it because I'd trusted Mark. That trust was about to cost me dearly if I didn't act fast. I drove home and went straight to my study. I kept paper copies of all my statements in file cabinets, organized by year and month. I pulled out the last 18 months of statements and spread them across my desk. Then I started reading. Really reading. Not just glancing at summaries, but examining every transaction, every trade, every fee, every transfer, line by line, page by page, with the analytical focus I'd used throughout my career. It took 4 hours. What I found made me physically ill. Over the past 18 months, there had been 63 transactions I didn't recognize, wire transfers to accounts I'd never heard of, purchases of investments I'd never approved, sales of holdings that generated losses instead of gains. Each transaction was relatively small, nothing over $15,000, carefully sized to avoid triggering obvious alarms. But together, they totaled $923,000. Nearly $1 million had been systematically removed from my portfolio over 18 months. And I'd missed it because I'd been looking at summary pages instead of transaction details. I sat back in my chair, feeling nauseous. How could I have been so careless? I'd built my career on attention to detail, on questioning everything, on verifying before trusting. And yet I'd let Mark handle my money with minimal oversight because he was professional and I was tired of managing investments myself. My son Brian's involvement was even more painful. Brian was 40 years old, worked in commercial real estate, made a decent living. Or so I'd thought. We'd never been particularly close. He'd always been more interested in money than in relationship. After Margaret died, he'd visited dutifully at first, but the visits had become less frequent over the years. I'd assumed he was busy with work and his own family. Now I understood. He'd been busy, just not with legitimate work. He'd been busy conspiring with Mark to steal from me. I needed to understand the full scope of what they'd done. I needed documentation. I needed evidence that would hold up if I went to authorities. And I needed to do it without alerting them that I knew. I opened my laptop and logged into my online account portal. Mark's firm provided digital access to all statements, transaction histories, account documents. I'd rarely used it, preferring paper statements. But now I needed everything I could get. I downloaded 18 months of detailed transaction records. I created a spreadsheet and began categorizing every suspicious transaction, wire transfers to unknown accounts, purchases of obscure investments that seemed designed to lose money, fees that appeared excessive or unjustified, sales of strong holdings at inopportune times. The pattern became clear. Mark and Brian were using multiple methods to drain money. Some transactions were outright theft, wire transfers to accounts they controlled. Others were more sophisticated, buying overpriced investments from shell companies they likely owned, or selling my holdings to entities that paid below market value, then pocketing the difference. They'd been careful. No single transaction was large enough to trigger automatic fraud detection. The monthly statements always showed reasonable balances because they'd timed the thefts to coincide with market gains, so the overall balance stayed relatively stable. To a casual observer, everything looked normal, but to someone who knew what to look for, it was obviously fraud. I found authorization forms in my digital files, documents supposedly signed by me approving various transactions. I examined the signatures carefully. They were good forgeries, close enough to pass casual inspection, but I knew my own signature. The pressure points were wrong. The flow was slightly off. These weren't signed by me. I photographed everything, Every suspicious transaction, every forged signature, every document that showed the systematic theft. Then, I backed up all the files to multiple cloud drives they couldn't access. By midnight, I had a comprehensive record of the fraud. $923,000 stolen over 18 months through 63 separate transactions. Documentation showing forged authorizations, evidence of shell companies used to facilitate the theft. Now, I needed to decide what to do with this evidence. Going to the police was the obvious answer. This was fraud, embezzlement, forgery, criminal acts that demanded prosecution. But I hesitated. Not because I wanted to protect Mark or Brian, but because I wanted to understand the full extent of their scheme before I exposed it. If I confronted them now, they'd destroy evidence. If I reported them to authorities immediately, they might have time to hide assets or flee. I needed to gather more intelligence. I needed to identify where the money had gone, which accounts they'd used, whether there were other victims, and I needed to do it carefully, quietly, without alerting them. The next morning, I called Mark's office and rescheduled our quarterly meeting. Something came up, I told his secretary. Family matter. Let's push it to next week. Of course, Mr. Carlyle. I'll have Mark call you to reschedule. No need. I'll call him next week. I wanted distance, time to investigate without the pressure of sitting across from Mark and pretending everything was fine. Then I called an old colleague, Robert Chen, who'd worked with me at the investment firm for 20 years before retiring and starting a forensic accounting practice. If anyone could help me trace where my money had gone, it was Robert. "Edward," Robert said warmly when he answered, "it's been too long." "How are you?" "I need your help, Robert." "Professional help? I think I'm being defrauded, and I need someone who can trace complex financial transactions." Robert's tone shifted immediately to serious. "Tell me what's happening." I explained everything. The overheard conversation, the suspicious transactions, the forged signatures. Robert listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Edward, if what you're describing is accurate, this is serious criminal fraud. You need to report this to the SEC and local authorities immediately." "I will. But first, I need to understand the full scope. I need to know where the money went, how much they've actually stolen, whether this is part of a larger scheme. Can you help me with that?" "I can. Send me everything you've documented. I'll do a complete forensic analysis. It'll take about a week." "Thank you, Robert. And please, keep this completely confidential. I don't want anyone to know I'm investigating yet." "You have my word." I sent Robert all my documentation that afternoon. 18 months of statements, the spreadsheet of suspicious transactions, photographs of forged signatures, everything I'd compiled. Then I did something I should have done years ago. I called my attorney, Patricia Morrison, a sharp woman in her 60s who'd handled my estate planning and business matters for decades. "Patricia, I need to see you today if possible. It's urgent. I have an opening at 4. What's this about?" "Financial fraud. I'll explain everything when I see you." At 4 o'clock, I sat in Patricia's office and walked her through the entire situation. She took notes, asked pointed questions, and when I finished, her expression was grave. "Edward, this is one of the most brazen cases of elder financial abuse I've encountered. Your own son conspiring with your trusted advisor to systematically drain your portfolio. The forged signatures alone are felony fraud. Combined with the theft, they're looking at serious prison time." "Brian is my son," I said quietly. "Part of me still can't believe he'd do this." "I understand. But Edward, you need to face reality. Your son sees you as a cash source, not as a father. He's willing to steal from you, to forge documents, to conspire against you. That's not love. That's exploitation." "I know. What do I need to do legally?" "First, we secure your remaining assets. I want you to immediately transfer all funds from Mark's management to a new advisor at a completely different firm. Today. Right now, while you're sitting here, we'll execute the transfer paperwork, and by close of business, Mark will no longer have access to your money." "Won't that alert him that I know?" "Yes, but it will also stop the bleeding. Edward, every day that money stays under his control is another day he can steal from you. We need to act now." She was right. I'd been so focused on gathering evidence that I'd forgotten the most important thing: protecting what I still had. We spent the next 2 hours executing transfers. Patricia called a trusted wealth management firm she'd worked with for years. They fast-tracked the account opening process. By 6 p.m., the remaining $3.6 million in my portfolio had been transferred to a new account at a new firm where neither Mark nor Brian had any access. "Now," Patricia said, "we report this to the authorities. I'm going to connect you with a detective I know in the financial crimes unit. Her name is Sarah Martinez, and she's excellent. She'll take your statement, review your evidence, and open a formal investigation." "What about Brian? What happens to him?" "If the evidence supports criminal charges, he'll be arrested and prosecuted. I know that's painful, Edward, but he made his choices. You're not responsible for the consequences of those choices." I drove home that evening feeling both relieved and devastated. Relieved that I'd stopped the theft, devastated that my own son had betrayed me so completely. My phone rang at 8 p.m., Mark Peterson. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Edward," Mark said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "What's going on?" "I just received notification that you've transferred your entire portfolio out of my management." "Why would you do that without discussing it with me?" "I think you know why, Mark." Silence on the line. Then, carefully, "I don't understand. Has something upset you? If there's been a misunderstanding—" "There's no misunderstanding. I know what you and Brian have been doing. I have documentation of every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every dollar you've stolen." More silence. Then Mark's voice changed, becoming cold and calculating. "Edward, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're making a serious mistake. Everything I've done has been with your full authorization. I have signed documents proving it. You have forged documents. There's a difference. Can you prove they're forged? Can you prove you didn't sign them and simply forgot? You're 72 years old, Edward. Your memory isn't what it used to be. If this goes to court, who do you think a jury will believe? The professional advisor with impeccable documentation, or the elderly client who can't remember what he signed?" "I'll take my chances," I said. "And Mark?" "I was an investment banker for 45 years. I know exactly what I signed and what I didn't. You and Brian underestimated me. That was your mistake." I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from anger, from the realization that Mark was right about one thing. This was going to be a fight. They would claim I'd approved everything and forgotten. They'd paint me as a confused old man. They'd use my age against me. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that retired meant incompetent, that elderly meant vulnerable, that trust meant stupidity. I was about to show them how wrong they were. So far, Edward discovered his financial advisor Mark and his own son Brian had systematically stolen $923,000 from his $4.5 million portfolio over 18 months. After overhearing them discussing the fraud and assuming he'd never notice because of his age, Edward used his 45 years of investment banking expertise to document every transaction. He transferred his remaining assets to safety and confronted Mark, who tried to gaslight him about his memory. Now, with forensic accountant Robert Chen analyzing the evidence and attorney Patricia Morrison coordinating the response, Edward is building a criminal case that will destroy both men. Detective Sarah Martinez met me at the police station the next morning. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and professional, with the kind of direct manner that comes from years of dealing with financial criminals. "Mr. Carlyle," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "Patricia Morrison speaks very highly of you. She says you've documented one of the most thorough fraud cases she's seen. I'd like to hear everything from the beginning." We sat in a conference room, and I walked her through the timeline, the overheard conversation that started everything, the 4 hours I'd spent analyzing statements, the 63 suspicious transactions, the forged signatures, the shell companies, the systematic theft of $923,000. Detective Martinez took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with something like respect. Mr. Carlyle, in my 15 years working financial crimes, I rarely see victims who document their cases this thoroughly. Most people discover they've been defrauded and panic. They confront the perpetrators, which gives them time to destroy evidence. They don't preserve documentation. You did everything right. I spent 45 years analyzing financial transactions, I said. It's second nature to me. Which is exactly why Mark Peterson and your son made a critical error. They assumed age equals incompetence. They thought you'd be an easy target. They underestimated your expertise. What happens now? I'm opening a formal investigation. I'll need copies of all your documentation. I'll subpoena Mark's firm for complete account records. I'll trace the wire transfers and identify the shell companies. We'll build a criminal case for fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. If the evidence supports it, and from what you've shown me it clearly does, we'll file charges. How long will that take? Several weeks at minimum. Financial fraud investigations are complex. We need to trace money flows, verify signatures through experts, interview witnesses. But Mr. Carlyle, you've done half our work already. The documentation you've provided gives us a roadmap. What about Brian? My son. What will happen to him? Detective Martinez's expression softened slightly. If he was actively involved in the fraud, which your evidence suggests he was, he'll face the same charges as Mark Peterson. I know that's difficult, but he made choices, and those choices have consequences. I left the police station feeling both validated and heavy-hearted. Validated that law enforcement was taking this seriously. Heavy-hearted knowing my son would likely go to prison. Robert Chen called that afternoon with his preliminary forensic analysis. Edward, I've traced about 60% of the transactions so far. What Mark and Brian did was sophisticated. They created multiple shell companies with names that sound legitimate. Horizon Investment Partners, Carlyle Family Trust Management, Summit Wealth Holdings. They used these entities to facilitate transfers that look like legitimate investment activities. But they were just theft? Exactly. For example, they'd sell one of your holdings to Summit Wealth Holdings at below market value. Summit would immediately resell it at market value and pocket the difference. Or they'd purchase an investment from Horizon Investment Partners at an inflated price. Horizon would kick back the excess to accounts Brian and Mark controlled. Very clever, very illegal. How much have they actually taken? Based on my analysis so far, $923,000 is accurate. But Edward, there's something else. I found evidence suggesting you're not their only victim. The same shell companies appear in transactions involving at least 3 other clients at Mark's firm. All elderly, all with substantial portfolios. I think Mark has been running this scheme for years. My stomach turned. Other victims? How much? I can't say for certain yet. I'd need access to their account records, which requires legal process. But conservatively, if the pattern holds, we're probably looking at several $1 million across multiple victims. We need to notify the authorities about this immediately. I've already informed Detective Martinez. She's expanding the investigation. This is bigger than just your case now, Edward. This is systematic elder financial abuse on a significant scale. After hanging up with Robert, I sat in my study staring at nothing. Mark hadn't just betrayed me. He'd made a career of targeting vulnerable elderly clients. And my son had helped him do it. Brian called that evening. I stared at the phone screen, my son's name displayed, and for a moment I considered not answering. But I needed to hear what he'd say. I needed to understand who he'd become. "Dad," Brian said when I answered. His voice was tight, strained. "We need to talk." "I agree. Come to the house tomorrow, 2 p.m. "Can't we just talk now?" "No, face-to-face, tomorrow." I hung up before he could argue. If he was going to try to explain himself, to justify what he'd done, I wanted to see his face. I wanted to watch him lie to me directly. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Brian as a child, the birthdays and holidays, teaching him to ride a bike, helping him with homework, Margaret and I putting him through college, the pride we'd felt watching him graduate, start his career, get married, have children of his own. Where had it gone wrong? When had he stopped seeing me as his father and started seeing me as a target? Brian arrived the next day at exactly 2 p.m. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, suit wrinkled. The confident commercial real estate agent replaced by someone who clearly hadn't slept well in days. "Dad," he said as I let him in, "I need to explain." "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the living room. We sat in the same chairs where he and his mother used to sit for family talks when he was a teenager. The irony wasn't lost on me. I know you found out about the investment issues," Brian began carefully, "and I know how it must look. But Dad, you have to understand, Mark convinced me this was legitimate. He said these transactions were standard rebalancing, that you'd approved everything. Don't lie to me, Brian. I heard you in Mark's office. I heard you discuss moving $380,000. I heard you talk about forging signatures. I heard you strategize about how I'd never notice because I'm old and trusting." Brian's face crumbled. For a moment he looked like he might maintain the lie. Then something broke. "Oh God, you heard that? Every word." "Dad, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. It started small. Mark said you had more money than you'd ever need. He said we were just accelerating my inheritance, that the money would have come to me eventually anyway. It seemed harmless at first." "Harmless? You stole nearly $1 million from me. You forged my signature. You conspired to defraud your own father." I know it's inexcusable. But Dad, I was desperate. My real estate business was failing. I had debts. Mark offered me a way out. He said it was victimless because you'd never miss the money." "Victimless? Brian, that's my retirement security. That's money I spent 45 years earning and investing. Money I plan to use for health care, for potential long-term care, for leaving something to my grandchildren. Your children, and you stole it. I'll pay it back. Every dollar, I swear. Just, please, don't go to the police. Don't destroy my life over this." "I've already gone to the police. There's an active investigation. And Brian, this isn't about destroying your life. This is about you destroying your own life through the choices you made." Brian stood abruptly, anger replacing remorse. "You're really going to send your own son to prison? For money? What kind of father does that? The kind who taught you right from wrong. The kind who believed you'd grown into an honest man. I'm not sending you to prison, Brian. You sent yourself there when you chose to commit crimes. I'm your son. And you treated me like a mark, like a target, like someone to exploit rather than someone to respect. You didn't see a father when you looked at me. You saw a bank account. That's not fair." "Fair? You want to talk about fair? You watched me grieve your mother for years. You saw how lonely I was after she died. And you used that vulnerability to get close to my finances so you and Mark could rob me. That's what's not fair." Brian walked to the door, his hand on the knob. He turned back and I saw something ugly in his expression. "You'll regret this. Mark has excellent lawyers. He'll make you look like a confused old man who doesn't remember approving legitimate transactions. Your memory against our documentation. Who do you think will win that fight?" "We'll see," I said calmly. "But Brian, there's something you should know. I'm not a confused old man. I'm a retired investment banker who knows exactly how to read financial statements and trace fraudulent transactions. I documented everything. I have forensic accountants analyzing your scheme. I have detectives investigating your shell companies, and I have something else." "What?" "I have evidence that you and Mark did this to other victims, elderly clients who trusted Mark the way I did. The investigation is expanding. This isn't just about me anymore. This is about a pattern of elder abuse, and that's going to make prosecutors very interested in making an example of both of you." Brian's face went pale. He opened his mouth, closed it, then left without another word. I sat alone in my living room afterward, feeling empty. That had been my son, the boy I'd raised, and he'd become someone I didn't recognize. Over the next 2 weeks, Detective Martinez's investigation intensified. She subpoenaed records from Mark's firm. She interviewed other clients. She brought in SEC investigators because the fraud crossed state lines and involved securities violations. Robert completed his forensic analysis. The final number was staggering. Across 4 elderly clients, including myself, Mark had stolen approximately $3.2 million over 5 years. The other victims were a widowed woman in her 70s who'd lost $800,000, a retired doctor who'd lost $900,000, and a former business owner who'd lost $600,000. All of them had trusted Mark completely. All of them had reviewed statements superficially. All of them had been too embarrassed or confused to question transactions when something seemed off. Detective Martinez arranged for me to meet the other victims. We gathered in a conference room at the police station, 4 elderly people who'd been betrayed by someone they'd trusted with their life savings. Margaret Chen was 76, a widow whose husband had left her a substantial portfolio. "I thought the market fluctuations explained the losses," she said quietly. Mark always had explanations. I felt stupid asking questions. He made me feel like I didn't understand finance. Dr. James Patterson was 71, a retired orthopedic surgeon. I was too busy during my career to manage investments myself. I trusted Mark because he came recommended. I never imagined he'd steal from me. Robert Williamson was 74, a former manufacturing company owner. Mark knew I had dementia, early stage but diagnosed. He used that. Every time I questioned something, he'd suggest I was confused, that my memory was failing. I started doubting myself. Listening to them, I felt rage building. Mark had deliberately targeted vulnerable elderly people. He'd identified their weaknesses, their loneliness, their trust, their cognitive decline, and he'd exploited all of it. "We're going to stop him," I said to the group, "all of us together. We're going to make sure he faces consequences, and we're going to warn others so this doesn't happen to anyone else." Margaret Chen nodded. "I want to testify. I want to tell a jury what he did to me. I don't care if it's embarrassing. People need to know." The others agreed. We would all testify. We would all fight back. 3 weeks after I'd overheard that conversation in Mark's office, Detective Martinez called with news. "Mr. Carlisle, we've completed the investigation. We're filing charges today. Mark Peterson is being charged with 15 counts of fraud, 12 counts of forgery, 8 counts of embezzlement, and 4 counts of elder financial abuse. Your son Brian is being charged with conspiracy and as an accessory to all the above crimes." "When will they be arrested?" "Within the hour. I wanted you to hear it from me first." I thanked her and hung up. Then I called Patricia Morrison and Robert Chen to share the news. Then I called my daughter-in-law, Brian's wife, to warn her what was coming. "Mr. Carlisle," she said when she answered. We'd never been close. She always seemed uncomfortable around me, like I was judging her. Maybe I had been. "Jennifer, I need you to know that Brian is being arrested today. For fraud. He and his business partner have been stealing from elderly clients, including me." Silence on the line. Then, softly, "I know. You know? I found out last week. Brian told me everything. He's been desperate, panicking. I've been trying to figure out what to do. I'm sorry you're going through this. I know you have children to think about. Mr. Carlisle, I'm filing for divorce. I can't stay with someone who would steal from his own father. The children and I are moving in with my parents. I just wanted you to know that I didn't know anything about this until recently, and I don't support what he did. I believe you. And Jennifer, if you or the children need anything, let me know. This is between me and Brian. I won't punish my grandchildren for their father's mistakes." She started crying. "Thank you. I was afraid you'd hate all of us. I could never hate those kids. They're innocent in this." Mark Peterson was arrested at his office that afternoon. According to Detective Martinez, he'd tried to claim innocence, insisted there had been a misunderstanding, demanded his lawyer. He was denied bail due to flight risk and held pending arraignment. Brian was arrested at his home 2 hours later. According to Jennifer, who called me afterward, he'd collapsed when the police arrived. No resistance, no protests, just complete breakdown. The arraignment happened 3 days later. I attended with Patricia Morrison. Mark stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive suit replaced by prison wear, his confident demeanor replaced by barely contained fear. The prosecutor outlined the charges. The judge reviewed the evidence summary. When it came time to set bail, the prosecutor argued strongly against it. Your Honor, Mr. Peterson systematically defrauded 4 elderly victims of over $3 million. He has significant financial resources hidden in offshore accounts. He has demonstrated complete disregard for the law and for the vulnerable people he targeted. He is an extreme flight risk. We request he be held without bail. Mark's attorney, an expensive-looking man in a perfectly tailored suit, argued that Mark had deep community ties, no prior criminal record, and would surrender his passport. But the judge wasn't swayed. Mr. Peterson, you are charged with crimes that demonstrate predatory behavior targeting vulnerable elderly individuals. You abused your position of trust systematically over multiple years. The court finds you are a danger to the community and a flight risk. Bail is denied. You will remain in custody pending trial. Mark's face crumpled. He'd expected to post bail and go home. Instead, he was going back to jail. Brian's arraignment was similar. The judge, seeing the pattern of crimes and Brian's role as Mark's accomplice, also denied bail. My son would wait in jail for trial. As I left the courthouse, reporters approached asking for comments. Patricia had warned me this would happen. Elder financial abuse was a hot topic. A trusted advisor stealing millions from vulnerable clients made for compelling news. I'd like to say something, I told Patricia. She nodded. Be careful. Don't prejudice the trial. I turned to the cameras and reporters. My name is Edward Carlisle. I'm 72 years old. I'm a retired investment banker, and I'm a victim of financial fraud perpetrated by someone I trusted completely. Mark Peterson stole nearly $1 million from me over 18 months. He did the same thing to 3 other elderly clients. He targeted us because he assumed we were vulnerable, confused, unlikely to fight back. He was wrong. We're fighting back. We're testifying. We're making sure he faces full consequences for what he's done. And I want other elderly people to hear this message. Trust, but verify. Review your financial statements carefully. Question anything that seems unusual. Don't let anyone make you feel stupid for asking questions. Your money, your life savings, your security matters. Protect it. The reporters asked follow-up questions, but Patricia guided me away. As we walked to the car, she smiled. That was perfect. Clear, strong, empowering. You just became the face of elder financial abuse prevention. I don't want to be famous. I just want people to be careful. You're going to help a lot of people, Edward. By speaking out, by fighting back, you're showing others they can do the same. The trial was scheduled for 4 months later. In the meantime, I worked with Detective Martinez and the prosecutor's office preparing testimony. I reviewed documents. I met with the other victims regularly. We formed a support group of sorts, helping each other process the betrayal and prepare for court. Margaret Chen became a particular friend. We'd have coffee weekly, discussing not just the case but life in general. She was sharp, funny, resilient, despite what she'd been through. You know what I realized? She said one afternoon. Mark didn't just steal money. He stole our confidence. He made us doubt ourselves, doubt our judgment. That's almost worse than the financial loss. But we're taking it back, I said. By fighting back, by refusing to be victims, we're reclaiming our power. She smiled. You're right. And honestly, I feel stronger now than I did before this happened. I'm not going to let anyone take advantage of me again. That was exactly how I felt. Yes, I'd lost money. Yes, my son had betrayed me. But I'd also discovered I was still capable, still sharp, still able to fight when necessary. At 72, I was more determined than ever to live life on my own terms. So far, Edward exposed a systematic fraud scheme where his financial advisor, Mark and son Brian, stole $923,000 from him and discovered 3 other elderly victims totaling $3.2 million in theft over 5 years. After documenting the crimes with forensic precision and cooperating with Detective Martinez's investigation, both Mark and Brian were arrested and denied bail. Now, as the trial approaches, Edward and the other victims are preparing to testify and ensure these predators face full consequences for targeting vulnerable elderly people. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in October, 4 months after the arrests. The courthouse was packed. Media coverage had been extensive. Elder financial abuse had become a national conversation, and our case was at the center of it. I sat in the gallery with Margaret Chen, Dr. Patterson, and Robert Williamson. We'd become close over the months of preparation, bonded by shared experience and shared determination. Patricia Morrison sat beside me, along with the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Karen Williams, a formidable woman in her 50s who specialized in financial crimes. Mark Peterson entered first, flanked by his expensive defense team. He'd lost weight during his months in jail. His suit was expensive but hung loosely on his frame. He didn't look at us. Brian came in next and my heart clenched despite everything. He looked terrible, gaunt, pale, broken. For a moment, I felt the instinct every father has, the desire to protect your child from harm. Then I remembered what he'd done, and the feeling passed. The jury selection had taken 2 days. 12 people, mostly middle-aged and older, people who might understand what it meant to trust someone with your life savings and have that trust destroyed. Karen Williams opened with a powerful statement. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about betrayal of the worst kind. Mark Peterson was entrusted with managing the retirement savings of vulnerable elderly clients. Instead of protecting them, he stole from them, systematically, deliberately, over years. He forged signatures, he created fake companies, he manipulated statements, and he did it all while looking his victims in the eye and assuring them he was protecting their interests. The defendant didn't just steal money, he stole security, he stole peace of mind. He stole the dignified retirement these people had spent lifetimes earning. And he did it without remorse, without conscience, because he saw them not as people, but as opportunities. Mark's lead attorney, Gerald Hoffman, countered with a different narrative. The prosecution wants you to believe Mark Peterson is a criminal mastermind who deliberately defrauded helpless elderly people. The truth is far more mundane. Mr. Peterson is a financial advisor who made aggressive investment decisions that sometimes resulted in losses. His clients, including Mr. Carlisle, signed authorization forms for every transaction. They approved the strategies. They understood the risks. What we have here is a case of buyer's remorse. These clients are embarrassed by investment losses and are trying to blame their advisor instead of accepting that markets fluctuate and sometimes investments lose money. It was exactly the defense strategy we'd expected. Blame the victims. Claim everything was authorized. Paint us as confused old people who didn't understand what we'd signed. The prosecution spent the first week presenting evidence. Forensic accountants testified about the shell companies and the flow of money. Handwriting experts testified about the forged signatures. Detective Martinez walked the jury through the investigation, showing how Mark had deliberately targeted elderly clients with substantial assets and limited financial sophistication. Then, Robert Chen took the stand. His testimony was devastating. For 3 hours, he walked the jury through complex financial transactions, breaking them down into simple terms anyone could understand. Mark Peterson created an elaborate scheme, Robert explained, pointing to charts and spreadsheets. He would identify a holding in a client's portfolio, let's say stock worth $100,000. He'd sell that stock to one of his shell companies, Summit Wealth Holdings, for $85,000. Summit would immediately resell it on the open market for $100,000. The $15,000 difference would be transferred to accounts Mark controlled. The client's statement would show the sale at $85,000, but it would be buried among dozens of transactions, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully. And this happened repeatedly, the prosecutor asked, 63 times in Mr. Carlisle's account alone, 214 times across all 4 victims. Every transaction appeared legitimate on the surface. But when you analyze the patterns, when you trace the money flows, the fraud becomes obvious. The defense tried to argue that these were normal market transactions, that clients sometimes got below market prices in volatile conditions. But Robert was prepared for every challenge. He showed comparable sales on the same days, proving the market prices. He demonstrated that the shell companies had no legitimate business purpose except to facilitate theft. Then it was my turn to testify. I'd been dreading this moment and anticipating it in equal measure. I wanted to tell my story, but I knew the defense would try to make me look foolish. Karen Williams led me through the direct examination. I explained my background, my 45 years as an investment banker, my expertise in financial analysis. I described meeting Mark, hiring him, trusting him for 15 years. Then, I described the day I'd overheard the conversation in his office. "Can you tell the jury what you heard?" Karen asked. I repeated the conversation word for word. I'd memorized it. Mark saying they'd already moved $380,000, Brian asking what if I read the detailed reports, Mark assuring him I wouldn't because old people trust their advisors. Several jurors were leaning forward now, focused intently. "What did you do after hearing this conversation?" "I went home and analyzed 18 months of statements in detail. I found 63 suspicious transactions totaling $923,000. I documented everything. Then, I transferred my remaining assets to a new advisor and contacted authorities." "Mr. Carlisle, the defense will argue that you approved all these transactions, that you signed authorization forms. Did you?" "I did not. The signatures on those forms are forgeries. I know my own signature. Those aren't mine." Gerald Hoffman's cross-examination was aggressive, just as we'd expected. He tried to suggest I was confused about what I'd signed. He implied my memory was unreliable at my age. He asked if I'd been evaluated for cognitive decline. "Mr. Carlisle, you're 72 years old. Isn't it possible you simply don't remember signing these authorization forms?" "No," I said firmly. "It's not possible. I have a perfect memory of every significant financial document I've signed in my life. That's part of my professional training. Those signatures are forged. But you admit you didn't read every line of every statement for 15 years? I reviewed summary pages in major holdings. That's standard practice for someone with a trusted advisor. But when I had reason to question the relationship, I read every transaction in detail. That's when I discovered the fraud. Isn't it true that you only started questioning things when market losses reduced your portfolio value?" "My portfolio value hadn't reduced due to market losses. It had reduced due to theft. The market was actually performing well during this period. My losses were from fraudulent transactions, not market conditions." Hoffman tried several more angles, but I held firm. I'd spent months preparing for this. I knew the facts better than anyone. He couldn't shake me. The defense's strategy became clear over the next few days. They couldn't really dispute the financial evidence, so they focused on painting us as vindictive, as people embarrassed by our own poor judgment, as elderly individuals easily confused about what we'd approved. But their strategy fell apart when Margaret Chen testified. She was 76, soft-spoken, grandmotherly. The jury clearly sympathized with her immediately. And when she described how Mark had made her feel stupid for questioning transactions, how he'd used her grief over her husband's death to manipulate her, there were tears in the courtroom. "He told me my husband would have wanted me to trust him," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "He said I was lucky to have someone looking out for me since I was all alone." And I believed him. I believed he cared about me. But he was just stealing from me, using my loneliness against me. Dr. Patterson's testimony was equally powerful. He described how Mark had used his busy medical practice against him, implying he didn't have time to manage investments properly, that he should just trust the expert. I trusted him completely. I thought that's what you were supposed to do with your financial advisor. I never imagined he'd steal from me. Robert Williamson's testimony was the most heartbreaking. His dementia was more advanced now than it had been when the fraud started. But he was still competent to testify, and his story was damning. "Mark knew I had memory problems," Robert said slowly, clearly struggling to maintain focus. "He used that. Every time I questioned something, he'd say I was confused, that I'd approved it and forgotten. He made me doubt myself. He made me feel like I was losing my mind. And all the while, he was stealing from me." The defense tried to argue that Robert's testimony was unreliable due to his cognitive decline, but the judge shut that down. Mr. Williamson is competent to testify about his own experiences. His memory of events before his diagnosis is clear. The jury will give his testimony appropriate weight. Then, Brian testified. His attorney had advised him to take a deal, to testify against Mark in exchange for reduced charges. Brian had refused initially, loyalty to his co-conspirator stronger than his loyalty to truth. But as the evidence mounted, as it became clear they would both be convicted, he'd changed his mind. Brian took the stand wearing prison orange, his hands shaking. He looked at me once, then looked away quickly. The prosecutor asked him to explain his involvement. Brian's testimony was devastating to Mark's defense. "Mark approached me about 3 years ago," Brian said. "He knew I was having financial problems. He said he had a way to make easy money. He'd been stealing from clients for years," he said, "and no one ever noticed. He wanted my help identifying transactions that wouldn't raise suspicion. In exchange, he'd give me a cut." "And you agreed?" "Yes. At first I told myself it wasn't really theft because the money would have been my inheritance eventually. My father wouldn't miss it. But as time went on, I knew it was wrong. I knew what we were doing was criminal. But I kept doing it anyway because I needed the money." "Did you know Mark was doing this to other clients besides your father?" "Yes. He told me about them. He called them his retirement plan. He'd steal from elderly clients for years. Then when he had enough money, he'd disappear. He was planning to leave the country. I was supposed to get one final payout, and then he'd be gone." This revelation caused a stir in the courtroom. Mark hadn't just been stealing to live lavishly. He'd been planning to flee with millions of stolen dollars. The defense tried to paint Brian as a liar trying to save himself, but the evidence supported everything he'd said. Investigators had found offshore accounts in Mark's name containing over $2 million. They'd found plane tickets to Brazil purchased under a false name. They'd found forged passports and identity documents. Mark Peterson wasn't just a fraudster. He was planning to vanish with his victims' money and leave them with nothing. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The defense put on their case, calling character witnesses who testified Mark was a good person, that this was all a misunderstanding. But the financial evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was devastating. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts, 15 fraud charges, 12 forgery charges, 8 embezzlement charges, 4 elder abuse charges, every single count. Mark showed no emotion when the verdict was read. Brian, tried separately but with a similar verdict, broke down sobbing. I felt nothing watching them. No satisfaction, no vindication, just emptiness. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 4 weeks later. In the meantime, I tried to return to some semblance of normal life. But I'd become something I'd never intended to be. An advocate, a voice for elder financial abuse victims. I received dozens of calls and emails from people who'd experienced similar fraud. Some had reported it and been ignored. Some hadn't reported it because they were embarrassed or didn't think anyone would believe them. Some were still in the middle of their own battles. I started speaking at senior centers, community groups, anywhere people would listen. I told my story. I explained the warning signs. I emphasized that being a victim of fraud wasn't shameful, that reporting it was courageous, that fighting back was possible. Margaret, Dr. Patterson, Robert, and I formed a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating elderly people about financial fraud and supporting victims through the reporting and recovery process. We called it Trust But Verify, the phrase I'd used in my first press statement. The sentencing hearing was packed. Media from across the country had come to cover it. This case had become symbolic of a larger problem. Tens of billions of dollars are stolen from elderly Americans every year through financial fraud. Our case was bringing attention to that epidemic. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided over the sentencing. She'd observed the entire trial with a stern expression. Now she looked at Mark Peterson with something close to contempt. "Mr. Peterson," she began, "I've been a judge for 26 years. I've seen every kind of criminal behavior imaginable. But cases like yours are particularly disturbing. You didn't steal from faceless corporations or government entities. You stole from vulnerable individuals who trusted you. You exploited their loneliness, their trust, their desire for connection and security. You made them doubt themselves. You made them feel stupid for questioning you. You used their age as a weapon against them, and you did it all while presenting yourself as their protector." She reviewed the sentencing guidelines, the prosecution's recommendations, the defense's pleas for leniency. Then she announced her decision. "Mark Peterson, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. You are sentenced to an additional 15 years for elder abuse. These sentences will run consecutively, not concurrently. You will serve 40 years. Given your age, this is effectively a life sentence. You will also pay restitution of $3.2 million to your victims. Every asset you have will be seized and liquidated. You will leave prison with nothing, the way you left your victims with nothing. 40 years. Mark was 51 now. He wouldn't be eligible for parole until he was 91. He would die in prison. Brian's sentencing was more lenient because of his cooperation, but still severe. 12 years in federal prison, full restitution of his portion of the theft, supervised release afterward. He was 40 now. He'd be 52 when released. His children would be adults. His marriage was over. His career was destroyed. As I left the courthouse after sentencing, reporters asked how I felt. Justice has been served, I said, but justice doesn't undo the harm. It doesn't restore the security these men stole. What I hope comes from this is awareness. I hope other elderly people will be more vigilant. I hope other financial advisors will think twice before exploiting vulnerable clients. And I hope families will talk about this, discuss how to protect elderly relatives, discuss warning signs, discuss the importance of oversight even when you trust someone. That was 18 months ago. Today, I'm 74 years old. I've recovered most of my stolen money through the restitution process and the liquidation of Mark's assets. My portfolio is being managed by a new advisor at a different firm, and I review every statement with the detailed scrutiny I should have been using all along. Brian is serving his sentence. I've had no contact with him. He writes letters occasionally, apologizing, asking for forgiveness. I don't respond. Maybe someday I will, but not yet. The wound is too fresh, the betrayal too complete. My grandchildren visit regularly. They're teenagers now, and they know what their father did. It's painful for them, but I try to be the stable, loving presence they need. I won't punish them for their father's sins. I've become friends with the other victims from our case. We meet monthly, sometimes just for coffee and conversation, sometimes to work on trust but verify initiatives. We've helped dozens of fraud victims navigate the reporting and recovery process. We've spoken at hundreds of events. We've written op-eds and appeared on news programs. We've become advocates because we refuse to be just victims. Margaret Chen is thriving. She's sharper and more confident than ever. You saved more than your own money, she told me once. You saved all of us. By fighting back, by documenting everything, you gave us a path to justice we wouldn't have had otherwise. I don't know if that's true, but I know this. Age doesn't equal incompetence. Retirement doesn't mean your professional skills vanish. Trust is important, but verification is essential. And when someone betrays you, fighting back is possible no matter how old you are. I spent 45 years as an investment banker, learning to analyze financial transactions, to spot irregularities, to question what doesn't make sense. Those skills didn't disappear when I turned 70. They saved me. They saved the other victims. They put 2 criminals in prison. If you're facing something similar, here's what I learned. Document everything. The moment something feels wrong, start keeping detailed records. Don't let anyone make you feel stupid for questioning things. You have every right to understand where your money goes. Get expert help immediately. Forensic accountants, attorneys who specialize in financial fraud, law enforcement. Don't try to handle it alone. The people defrauding you are professionals. You need professionals on your side. Don't be embarrassed. Financial fraud happens to smart people, to successful people, to careful people. The shame belongs to the criminals, not the victims. Report it. Pursue it. Make them face consequences. Stay connected to people you trust. Isolation makes you vulnerable. Keep friends and family involved in your life. Let them help you review important decisions. Multiple sets of eyes catch things one person might miss. Keep your professional skills sharp. I'm a retired investment banker, but I'm still an investment banker. My knowledge and expertise didn't retire when I did. Your skills, whatever they are, remain valuable. Use them, trust them, and finally, know that fighting back is worth it. Yes, it's exhausting. Yes, it's painful, especially when family is involved. Yes, it takes time and energy and emotional reserves you might not think you have. But it's worth it. Not just for the money, though, that matters. For your dignity, for your sense of agency, for proving to yourself and the world that you're not helpless. Mark and Brian thought I'd be an easy target. A lonely 72-year-old widower who trusted his advisor and his son completely. Someone who wouldn't notice, someone who wouldn't fight back, someone who'd accept their gaslighting about memory and confusion. They were wrong, and their mistake cost them their freedom. I'm Edward Carlisle. I'm 74 years old. I'm a retired investment banker who refused to let anyone steal my life savings or my dignity. I'm a victim who became an advocate. I'm proof that age brings wisdom, that experience has value, and that you're never too old to demand justice. My money is secure now. My life is full. I have friends, grandchildren, purpose. I speak publicly about fraud prevention. I help other victims. I live well. And every day, I'm grateful I overheard that conversation in Mark's office. Grateful I trusted my instincts. Grateful I used my skills. Grateful I fought back. Mark Peterson and Brian Carlisle are in prison. They'll be there for decades, and I'm free. Living proof that predators lose when their prey fights back. Did you like this story? Let me know in the comments where you're listening from.